Okay, hello, and thank you everyone who has just joined us. I would like to say thanks for being here. You have joined the Daniel O. Trainer Wildlife Health Seminar Series hosted by Wisconsin Center for Wildlife. And this is, and today we are featuring Dr. William Karesh with his presentation on COVID-19 and the nature of disease emergence. But before we begin, I would like to first say thank you to everyone who has helped organize this seminar series. Along with myself, my name is Jennifer Summers, and I'm the Program Development Specialist at Wisconsin Center for Wildlife. I would like to thank Shelley Dubé and Marie Perkins and Ben Sunninger, who are our wildlife faculty here at UW-SP that helped me organize this. And of course, Scott Hengstrom, who is the director of the Wisconsin Center for Wildlife and is a UW Extension Specialist. And this is hosted also through the College of Natural Resources. So I'd like to say thank you to all of those people. So this is a seminar in a series of seminars. And so this is the third now. So we have two other presentations, and there are on Thursdays at 4 o'clock from here going forward, except for Thanksgiving. So we invite you to join us again next week, and we look forward to having our future presenters. And if you want more information, you can see our website at uwsp.edu/WCW. Next, we recognize the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point occupies lands of the Ho-Chunk and Menominee people. Please take a moment to acknowledge and honor the ancestral Ho-Chunk and Menominee land and the sacred land of all Indigenous peoples. And finally, before I continue, I would like to note just a little etiquette here. If you could please be sure to, you can ask questions during the seminar at any time. Put them in the chat feature of Zoom, and please keep your videos off for the duration of the seminar, please. And you, again, put all your questions in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm Scott Hengstrom. I'm the director of the Wisconsin Center for Wildlife, and it really is an honor to welcome all of you here to the Dr. Daniel Trainer Seminar Series in Wildlife Health. Daniel Trainer really is a legacy, and he was one of us. He's here at the College of Natural Resources. He was internationally recognized expert in wildlife diseases back in the 60s and 70s. He was a co-author of two of the primary textbooks on infectious diseases of wild mammals and wild birds back in the day. 1972, he was recognized with the Distinguished Service Award by the Wildlife Diseases Association. But he was not just a wildlife disease expert. He was also a real people person. He became the dean of our College of Natural Resources here at UW-Stevens Point in 1971 and continued in that role until 1987. I was one of the beneficiaries. I was a graduate student here back in the early 80s. I took his course in wildlife diseases, and he was an exceptional teacher. And I can say that because of his efforts, it's one of the reasons why I went on to follow, in part, a pathway that involved wildlife diseases in my career. He was more than just a college dean, too. He was very much involved in conservation of natural resources in the state of Wisconsin and nationally. He served on the Natural Resources Board for the state of Wisconsin from 1980 to 86 before his retirement. And if any of you wonder what it means when you're directed to go to room 100 TNR, well, that means the Trainer Natural Resources Building. Our building in which the College of Natural Resources is housed is named after Dr. and Dean Trainer. And it serves as a legacy to what he did here in Wisconsin for the College of Natural Resources and the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point. And it's an honor to be here and to have speakers speaking in this seminar series. With that, I'll reiterate what Jennifer mentioned about, if you would please put your mic on mute, and if you have questions as we're rolling through, please type them up in the chat room, and we'll answer those questions after our speaker is finished. With that, I'd like to introduce our professor, Dr. Shelley Dubé, who will be introducing our speaker today.
Thank you, Scott. It is really a really distinct honor for me to introduce Dr. Karesh today. Gosh, Billy and I have known each other for a lot longer. We don't look old enough to have known each other as long as we have known each other. But he's been featured in books like Spillover, because he was the veterinarian who was tasked with going out and darting gorillas to test them for AIDS and simian AIDS. And he received the Beth Williams and Tom Thorne Distinguished Award by the Wildlife Disease Association last year. And that award is given out very reluctantly, I should say, by the Wildlife Disease Association. And they give it out for somebody who's done exemplary work and made an exemplary contribution, combining wildlife disease and management or policy. And I think that it really embodies the bulk of Billy's career, working on the front lines, collecting samples, and then trying to figure out how to make things better from a policy perspective. And he is currently the Executive Vice President for Health and Policy for the EcoHealth Alliance. He served as an inter-project liaison for the USAID Emerging Pandemic Threats Predict 2 program. And he's a member of the World Health Organization's IHR roster of experts. Anytime there is a pandemic going on or potential pandemic, Billy is one of the first contacts around the world. And so I just can't tell you how excited I am to have him here today. So with that, I'll send it over to Billy.
Right. Thank you, Shelley. It was very kind of you, and it's really an honor to be here and be with all of you out there in Wisconsin. Too bad I can't be with you in real life, but it's a pleasure to be asked to speak with you. So yes, Professor D.V.M, I think it's about 30 years. You must have been like 7 or 8 years old, and we were collaring white-tailed deer about 20 miles from here in Westchester County when we were working together. So it's been a while. So let me just jump into my presentation. And there we go. I'll go with that and talk a little about why we have emerging diseases and pandemics and COVID-19, and end up with a little policy discussion. And please do, we're not really set up for questions during the presentation, but put them and type them in the chat room, and we should have a good conversation as I wrap up. And I shouldn't go really too long, so we'll have time for conversation. So there's a variety of ways, and some of you are familiar, staying up with this literature on emerging infectious diseases and different ways to look at them. It's very common with disease work just to simply map out the occurrence of diseases. And this is a 5-decade report of each independent emerging infectious disease event. This includes antimicrobial resistance, zoonotic diseases, non-zoonotic diseases, and you map those out. But of course, what we do know is it's very biased. So there's a tremendous amount of reporting bias just built in inherently, because it's based on where people work and who publishes in the literature, and how that goes on record and who has diagnostic capabilities in the first place. So it really gives you a very skewed view of what the world looks like and where the risk of emerging diseases take place. So there's early work was done, I don't know, 10, 12 years ago now. And part of this work and what we've continued to do at EcoHealth Alliance is look at each one of those individual reports of an emerging disease event and look at what some of the underlying risk factors are. They tend to, in the conservation world, people call them drivers of these events. So depending on your terminology in public health, they try to think more of them as risk factors, but they're whatever they are. They at a mathematical level or statistically, we're talking about correlations. What correlates with these events and what were those factors? So when we look over that same period of time, 50 years of emerging infectious disease events, we see that these activities tend to correlate with those events. And a large part of that is how we use land use change, agricultural industry change, travel and trade, which we always think about with pandemics, of course, because they have to move around. But it's actually a smaller component of that. of those correlates. So really we're talking about is what's going on with human and the living world, the ecology of the planet, including the ecology of humans and what humans do. When we map those correlates, when we map those factors, we get a very different view of the world. And we kind of think of this more as a predictive model because we're not looking at historically about the individual events. We're looking about where do those factors exist on the planet. And that's basically a heat map of where the risk factors are for disease emergence. So it gives us a little different view of what to look for. And these are related to infectious diseases from wildlife, zoonotic diseases from wildlife. This map does not include things like antimicrobial resistance. And of course, this is, we continue to work with this and update that, but you see a trend line over the last 50 or 60 years of the frequency of events. And this is accounting for reporting bias. So taking that into account, we see a trend line of new emerging infectious diseases. Not too surprising over 50 or 60 years if you think about just the human population and what we're doing on the planet and the use of the way, you know, our interactions with land and travel and trade, those other factors. So it's not too surprising that we're getting those increasing, but in whatever, any way you want to look at that, there's a large percentage of those, of course, that are zoonotic. And from the zoonotic emerging infectious diseases, you see that a majority are linked to wildlife. So you kind of have different groupings and people think of it different ways. And sometimes it does get a little confusing about what people are talking about. Are they talking about all emerging diseases, emerging infectious diseases, the zoonotic ones? And of those zoonotic ones, which are the majority, most of those are from wildlife. So what people have been talking about for years is, can we get ahead to the left of boom, as they say in the security sector? We want to get ahead of the boom and before the explosion. In epidemiology, they talk about to the left of the epi curve. But nonetheless, I think all of you that are on this call today do think about this world on the left, which is about animals, wildlife, land, changing ecology, habitat loss, and ecosystem changes. And what does that mean? I mean, we kind of use this slide a lot to talk about One Health, and we don't have to really go into any of that terminology today, but you know, what land use change is really happening. This is a logging camp, a typical logging camp in the Congo. So they go into very pristine forest areas, cut a road into the area, build a logging camp that has about 3,000 workers are brought in to a very, you know, relatively untouched area. Of course, few people live there. And then on the left, you see a whole community grows up that supplies the workers in the logging camp because they come in. This is called a dry logging camp. That means that food and provisions are not provided to the workers by the forestry company, that they have to fend for themselves. So what you get is a community that also moves in, migrates into this area, and they supply meat and soap and alcohol and tobacco and other items that people might want to buy now that these workers are getting paid every week. So it establishes a whole new community with exposure to animals that did not exist previously, at least not at this scale. And so then, of course, there's a picture of a gorilla arm that's being sold for meat. So what happens is they harvest all the wildlife in the surrounding area and sell that as a meat product, as a protein product for the workers. And then you can, if you had a satellite image, you would see this repeated every 30, 40, 50, 60 kilometers as these logging camps are built up to extract wood from tropical forests. When you look at just specific areas like Central Africa alone, the best calculations on bush meat or wild meat consumption is about 1 billion kilograms a year. Everybody talks about Ebola, of course, and as Shelley had mentioned, I've been involved with these Ebola outbreaks, but typically what happens in our current world is we wait for these outbreaks, we wait for a large epidemic, the international community responds, and this is what we think of as the proper approach to controlling emergent diseases, which is suit up in hazmat suits, fly in lots of people, and try to safely bury dead people, instead of really focusing on what's driving that and putting prevention into the process. So what we've been trying to do in many of our projects is start to kind of take that multi-sectoral approach and build them into our wildlife research projects or our infectious disease research, and not just focus on one particular area or one sector. So we're looking at, this is Rift Valley fever. It's a mosquito-borne arboviral disease in humans. There's no treatment. Mortality ranges between 1 to 5, sometimes 10%, but it's pretty low mortality, 1 or higher than COVID-19, but not like Ebola. But it circulates through livestock first. In livestock, it's pretty devastating because infected sheep or goats. So for sheep ranching people, they lose their whole lamb crop for the year is lost immediately. So they have massive abortion storms that just go on through all the farms in the area. The link to wildlife is not clear, but we get positive wildlife. It's not so clear on their reproductive impact because the monitoring of wildlife populations, as you know, is a little hard to determine what those losses might be if they are having stillbirths or miscarriages. We have a mosquito team looking at the vectors. We have a human anthropology team working out there at the same time, looking at human behavior. Vegetation ecologists out there looking at really doing plots around where the outbreaks occur to see if there's correlates with certain types of vegetation. And actually that's turned out to be very useful. And even soil scientists taking soil core samples to see, and we found correlations with the amount of calcium in the soil relates to where the larger outbreaks are. So you could actually use that to start mapping as another way to do risk mapping based on soil composition and geology. So we try to bring in as many teams as we can, and of course climate, because it's a mosquito-borne disease. And can we predict these ahead of time and get ranchers and farmers to vaccinate in front before there's outbreaks, and thus protect their herds, but also protect people. People get the disease from contact with infected animals. And a similar kind of that multi-sectoral One Health approach for influenza. So, this is a no-brainer. We all know that influenza circulates in wildlife regularly. There's wild birds or mammals, we know it circulates in, and every once in a while it jumps the species barrier between the wild populations and domestic animals, chickens, pigs, horses, dogs, cats, and then of course humans to become whatever the current dominant strain is. And we've done some work for years in gearing up surveillance programs in wildlife to actually pick up on influenza strains prior to them getting into humans. This is an old picture from actually collecting a H5N1 sample in Mongolia from swans that was used for the human vaccine. So if even this now, still, there's part of the construct is used in even this year's human flu vaccine goes back to a wild swan in Mongolia that was brought back to the US, shared with USDA and CDC. They gave it to WHO, who then added it to the flu construct, which changes a little every year. But we're still dealing with these influenzas that really for 100 years, it's very similar virus. So when we look at that and kind of that theme I'm saying is like, how can we work more upstream to prevent emerging diseases? What can we do to prevent epidemics? What can we do to prevent pandemics? So we've done some look at the more of a policy and operational level across countries and across organizations and agencies. And this report's available. You can download it from the web. It's called Building Resilience to Biothreats. And you can kind of see without having to even read this, but you can see our columns there where we kind of divided the health security world into prevent, detect, respond, and recover. And you can kind of see which organizations and who and where the money's going. And most money, as I mentioned before, goes into response and responding to these problems and not into prevention or early detection, and really not very great investments in recovery And when we think about recovery, we're talking about recovering in a way that actually leads back to prevention. So it's really a circular approach. Those recovery dollars should build in prevention, but it's typically ignored. And I think that's part of human nature. You deal with the current emergency. As soon as it's over, you try to forget that it ever happened and move on with your life and not think about it again. So it's very hard to get investments in prevention. And those of us living and working with wildlife kind of understand that. I really won't get into this, but you'll have this later for your use. When we started talking to organizations about what are you doing in the area of prevention, or are you doing prevention? And everybody says, yes, we do. So we realized we actually have to break it down into functions and get very specific when we're asking them and say, do you do any of these functions? And then it becomes clear that people aren't really investing or doing much in prevention or detection. So when you get a little more specific about what's meant by these different areas of investment and effort, you start to get a clearer picture of what's not being done where investments are not going. And I'll try and get back to that when I finish. So how does all that link into COVID-19? Well, we know from work that's been going on for years that coronaviruses, we had SARS, and then there's these SARS-related, some people say SARS-like, but let's say SARS-related viruses are really common in bats. We've been doing a lot of work with our partners, EcoHealth Alliance, with our partners in China for years, and looking at bats and sampling for coronaviruses there. And you can kind of see a little map of where we've been detecting coronavirus positive bats there, and the range, and these are all the group that is SARS related. And you can see kind of the prevalence there based, and this is PCR testing. This is not serology. So to actually have, antigen positive and across quite a number of different species, these rhinolophus, the horseshoe bats, were really commonly positive, but not restricted just to those. So you have a number of species where the viruses are quite prevalent. They're just on a routine basis in everyday life for the last couple of years. We've been seeing that. This came out a few years ago, and we thought it would have given us a little more warning about how rich that gene pool of these SARS-like viruses are really in bats. And as you start to put them together, this is kind of the grouping down there in red. And this last one, RATG, this RATG13, is the one that's the most closely related to the current human COVID-19 virus. But you see a whole group of these viruses in bats, and they kind of fall together, but it's not just bats. We know that these coronaviruses are in quite a few species. But when we really wanted to go into the next step and look at people, so we started doing serology on people that are living in those areas where we're finding the positive bats, and looking really first back at SARS and now more recently with COVID-19. So we really kind of started with bat sampling, then identifying the roost in the roost areas and caves where the bats were living, and then going out and finding people that were in contact with them and enrolling them into surveillance or testing programs for humans, and doing some behavior and anthropology work around that, which I don't have a lot of time to get into, but you start to identify human risk factors, what their behaviors, what they do, that kind of showed some also correlations, of course, with exposure. But we found about 0.5% to 3% of the people, depending on which province they lived in and where they were, or already had antibodies. So this is pre-COVID-19, but that's a pretty large number of prevalence when you start to think about the populations of the people in those areas. And there's a really broad distribution of that group of rhinolophus bats and that group of those SARS-related coronavirus bats. So it's not just a China issue. Of course, we were looking in southern China, but when you look at the range maps for those species, this is one particular species there on the right in red, but this is all the other kind of related bats with these related coronaviruses in general. and you start to think about the human population that's routinely at risk of exposure. So we came up with numbers here using that 0.5 to 3% of roughly 3 million to 20 million people have or serology positive to this group of viruses prior to COVID-19. So it's not very surprising that one of those viruses, one of those infected people, was able to develop into what we're seeing now with COVID-19. It doesn't take much stretch of an imagination to think 3 to 5 million infected people, 10 million infected people, that one of those infections changed enough and there was enough change in that virus or mutation, whatever was necessary for that to easily become spreadable among humans. And so this is really the story of emerging infectious diseases. So you have the early spillover events, we have them all the time, and they're dead ends. They don't go very far. It doesn't become human to human transmittable very easily. And then every once in a while, we have one that is successful at human to human transmission. And you have either a large outbreak, an epidemic, or a pandemic. It's not just humans. We've been seeing these viruses in other species. We've had outbreaks of other coronaviruses from bats detected in pigs and domestic pigs. There was one outbreak a year and a half ago in China. It didn't get a lot of attention. About 20,000 pigs died, piglets died. They went in and culled around the farms, seemed to have gotten under control. But once again, everybody thought it was limited to that one location in China where it happened to be detected, but really have not looked further than that. And so once again, when you look at a range map and what's the potential risk for pig farms in other parts of Southeast Asia, you can see the distribution of those bats is pretty broad in those viruses. And of course, other animals in COVID-19, you've heard about it getting into dogs is pretty non-productive. Cats, it is. Mink, we've been hearing a lot about because it's really transmitted easily amongst mink. Ferrets, certainly concerned about, we know from lab experiments. Non-human primates, of course, have been infected. Other bat species, and really kind of this last part gets into, what is the risk of humans actually reintroducing this into new reservoir species around the world. So that's drawing our attention and trying to put some prevention into place. So people like us that actually work with wildlife and work with bats do not accidentally introduce this new strain, this COVID-19, back into wildlife populations, which we know it's very, very difficult to get out. So when I talk to people at the World Health Organization about that concern, they roll their eyes and think I'm crazy. And then I say, well, what about plague? That seems to have gotten established all around the world by people moving it and spreading it. And now it's in rodents everywhere. And then they get nervous and go like, oh yeah, that's a problem. So, when we do communicate these things, you have to put it into some context that people can relate to. So let me just finish up then with, who is paying attention. So I kind of referred to that with WHO, and I don't know how many of you are getting engaged with some of these global efforts like global health security. There's a big movement with the global health security agenda to get more countries on board so they can move. And in theory, the GHSA is about prevention, early detection, reporting, and response. And there are a lot of different types of assessments that are being rolled out in countries. A tremendous amount of money is actually being spent on national assessments. The US has done theirs, and we got the highest score possible in our JEE score. But despite that, we seem to still be having trouble dealing with a pandemic. So now we're starting to even question the validity of the process of evaluating. But I would say that it does identify gaps that are worth investment. When we look at it from a wildlife perspective, we see they don't really come up in these countrywide investments. So this blue one is professional veterinary services assessments. They've been done in 40 or 50 countries by the OIE, the World Animal Health Organization, the World Organization for Animal Health. Those are the blue ones. And we reviewed every one that's published and said, do they mention wildlife or did they mention the environment? and you see only about 50% mention the environment and 80% mention wildlife in their national plans, veterinary plans. That would be our USDA equivalent. But we counted, they got a score as a positive score, even if they said, we don't do any wildlife work. They still got a score for mentioning it. So don't even overinterpret the fact that 80% or 20% didn't. A lot of the countries that reported wildlife said we don't do it. So it's really grim for the environment, because only about half actually even mentioned the environment, and most of those said we don't do work in environmental issues. So it's kind of sad, and weather and climate's really poorly reported. For the orange one is this WHO, World Public Health. It's called the Joint External Evaluation, and does include zoonotic diseases. And you see things do get mentioned more, but once again, when you read those, you get examples like here, there is, no wildlife or disease input into surveillance system. We scored them as a positive. Yes, they mentioned it, but the truth is it doesn't get much attention in countries around the world. And we do a lot of work with the World Bank, and they've, have access to country budgets and data that are not generally made public. So we've been able to look a little more deeply. And if my previous discussion didn't make you depressed, I hope this does. This is about funding for wildlife disease work. And these are kind of annual investments per country, and what, operating costs. And you start to see like $9,000 and $10,000 and $4,000, coming out of a lot of these countries. And they're looking in general about wildlife management in general is so poorly funded at a global scale. And of that, the best estimates from the bank and what we've been able to figure out, of all wildlife management services that countries are spending money on, only about 5% of that is really related to wildlife diseases. So if we think wildlife management is under-resourced, the wildlife disease world is hardly worth mentioning, because it's just really kind of deplorable. So we're really trying to build some support for increasing this. We got a report now coming out, we just finished for the World Bank, where the World Bank is going to start serious investment in wildlife health and environmental health investments in developing countries, because by getting them engaged in these analyses, from their own data, it's kind of really opened their eyes about a missing gap. And then of course, outbreaks and pandemics, Ebola, and the cost of Ebola, and the cost of SARS, and the cost of COVID-19. These are bankers, so that opens their eyes too. So they're willing to kind of rethink where they're starting to put their money and invest in prevention a little more. Even the World Health Organization, they've really been great. I'm engaged with them last year, all of this year really, and they typically will come out with a research and development blueprint for new diseases. They'll do disease X, but they jumped on this novel coronavirus early in the year, and really, because they bring together the biggest donors, those are countries and private donors, and set the priorities for research. And with COVID-19, it's been actually a sea change, and they immediately brought in the wildlife community and the animal community and set it one of the thematic areas. So the second thematic area for all of WHO's research and development efforts related about, we got them convinced about preventing future spillover and now spill back and risk reduction strategies. So we're feeling good that the world is thinking about it differently. And then hopefully that will be followed with money and investments for the kind of work you do to really understand wildlife diseases more completely. And then how's it all fit together? There's a confusing world of international policies and programs. So I threw a bunch of them at you before. So in some of the work we've done with the bank, we've actually tried to create a kind of a roadmap or a map that makes it easier to understand. So earlier here on the upper right, these planning tools, I mentioned the PBS, or those are assessment tools, the JEE here in the middle, and the veterinary service, those are assessment tools. And They require a lot of work from the countries, but they're followed on, of course, by another set of tools, these planning tools, and there's a lot of workshops, and there are a lot of bureaucracy, and there are a lot of people, and I sometimes just, want to shoot myself and go like, I can't go to another workshop. But there is some method to the madness when you start to think through what happens, and those supposed to lead then to funding, implementation resources. And then there is this need for expert networks. All of you could start to participate in those kinds of things. So I think as you kind of tease the parts, tease them apart, put these, just break it down in discrete units, it's a little easier to understand who's doing what and how it fits together. And we use this kind of a guide to help countries think through what they're doing. And really trying to get upstream once again. And there's the UN framework for disaster risk reduction. They've never considered diseases in their risk reduction strategy. So every country, including the United States, has a disaster risk reduction strategy. They don't normally involve health people or wildlife people or environment people. So we presented this to 3,000 people at one of their conventions, their annual meeting of the parties, about shifting this paradigm from response to actually building in risk mitigation to emerging disease or other disease threats. And it seemed to be well received. We were talking to a group of people who think about risk reduction strategies. They just never really thought of diseases as being a disaster by themselves. They always thought of disasters resulting in disease problems. So you have a flood or tsunami, and then part of the process was to get ready for a cholera outbreak. They always thought of it as a secondary sequela or a sequela from the disaster itself. So it's been important to see if we can get that community to rethink, because they do prevention strategies for earthquakes. They do prevention strategies for other natural disasters. Not that you can prevent the disaster, but you can mitigate the effects. And so it's a good group of people to talk with about mitigating the impact of emerging infectious diseases. And then finally, hopefully in the next few days, we're going to release this report about urgent needs for global wildlife health, because more and more from all of these pandemics, we're seeing there's just big gaps. And it's not just about money. It's really about a lack of attention on what needs to be done. There's a huge lack of attention. We broke it down into diagnostics and investigation, reporting, planning and response, and development strategies for countries to really gear them up. So hopefully I can get this to you. Hopefully we'll have this out next week, and please feel free to circulate that. So I'll close with that, and then we'll see if there are any questions or people just have other things they think are great ideas. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, there would be lots of clapping right now. Shelley, did you want to ask the questions, or would you like me to? Oh, you're muted.
I am muted. So many people would love to be able to mute me. Haha. Saul Sepsenwall is a retired biology faculty, Billy, and his question is two questions. One, how much are wet markets responsible for annual influenzas? And two, how hopeful are you that at least China will eliminate wet markets?
Okay. Well, number one, they're both great questions. So wet markets, for one, I think everybody has a different definition of what a wet market is. So it's a very broad answer, but related to influenza, we're really talking about live chickens, live poultry, maybe live pigs in markets where the consumer comes in and picks out their animal while it's still alive, and then it's slaughtered on premises, or they take it home live, but oftentimes just slaughtered in front of the consumer. And we have those in the US. We have them they're really common actually where I live now in New York. There are live animal, they're wet markets, and people will go and they'll pick out their chickens. There used to be hundreds of them. USDA has closed down a lot of them because of avian influenza, actually. but now they get inspected on a weekly basis. In Asia, there are hundreds of millions of people that buy their food at a wet market every week. So you have a different level of exposure. You know, now we're talking about millions of people exposed to live animals in markets. One of the problems is these markets are not very clean. I mean, they are filled with feces and urine, and it's flying all over the place. And there's no real hygiene going on. And there are thousands of people walking through there. And then the animals come and go. So you have markets of people will take their live animals back home at night and bring them to a different market the next day or another market. So you have this constant mixing. So it's been a huge problem for influenza. And good work done like in Indonesia and parts of Thailand, particularly in Indonesia, when they follow animals like from the farm at the community level, they're not detecting influenza, but they are in the markets. And the markets, because of all that mixing of lots of live animals and the contamination, they become a real focal point for the dissemination of influenzas. Now, how much does that get into the annual human influenza? That's a tough question. And I don't think it's very common. So you know, we get one or basically a dominant human strain every year or two. But there's not just one, there's multiple strains that are circulating. But we have a dominant strain. And it starts a year before, 2 or 3 years before, and I would defer to good influenza experts. Maybe there's some on the call. But there's kind of a progression of the dominant strain, you know, from year to year. And when those really get started is really hard to figure out, and where exactly that came from and where the mixing occurred and where the spillover occurs. So it's hard to say. But we do know where they clean up the wet markets, like in Hong Kong has done a very good job. Every night, all the markets are depopulated. No chicken leaves the market alive. End of the day, they're all slaughtered. The whole place is clean. It's closed. It's disinfected. And then by the next morning, it's, you know, nice and clean again. It's all been sanitized, sprayed down, dried out overnight, and they open again the next day. Where they've done that in the markets like in Hong Kong, they basically kind of eliminated their influenza problem and Newcastle's disease too. It's really good controlling disease by not letting these animals come and go. The rest of Asia, Africa, South America, North America is kind of still a mess. That's a long answer for number one. China has eliminated, they closed their live animal markets. They do it, you know, they did it with SARS. They closed, I think they arrested 10,000 people or 5,000 people, and they closed hundreds and hundreds of markets. And they've done it again with COVID-19. There's a big pressure though, the wildlife trade, the wildlife part of the wet markets, not the chicken, poultry, other animal part, but just the wildlife part of those markets in China was worth, it's about 80 or 90 million dollars a year in revenue for producers. And a lot of that's farm, not all of it. A lot of it's wild caught from other parts of the world. We export turtles from Florida to China for the live animal markets, for wet markets in China. So we export a lot of wildlife to China. But it's worth a lot of money. So we'll see how long they can keep it closed. But, you know, they used to say it's worth too much money. But now that they've lost $1 trillion with COVID-19, I think that's changed their perspective. You know, 80 million used to sound like a lot, but $1 trillion really sounds horrible. So they're going like, oh, maybe it's worth it. So we'll see. I'm hopeful they won't come back. But other countries, Indonesia, Thailand, Cambodia, Myanmar, you name it there, and it's throughout Africa. You go to South America, you see it a bit, Peru, Chile. It's still a problem.
Great, thank you. I think that my question, I wrote it, did the pigs get it from bat guano? I must have been about maybe Rift Valley virus. I don't remember now which of your slides that I had typed that in. It was the one where pigs got something from rhinolophid bats.
Yeah, that was another coronavirus, and we call it SADS, severe acute diarrhea syndrome virus. But it's a closely related coronavirus. And we don't know, but we do routinely when we sample bats, we do an oral swab, a fecal swab, and if we can get a urine sample, we get a urine sample. We don't do any terminal or destructive sampling. And a lot of our coronavirus, all those, when I showed that, there's been about 500 different coronaviruses now identified in China in that area from bats. That rich gene pool paper is really, or more recent paper, is about 500 different coronaviruses. Those are coming from fecal and urine samples. So it's very likely, though I don't know if it's like from somebody shoving guano. I think it's more about bats just going into pig farms, or they go in the barns, they go in the under the shelters and either contaminate the pigs. With Nipah virus, they were fruit bats actually eating the fruit and dropping the fruit with the saliva contamination. But I think for these in China, I'm more likely it's urine or fecal contamination, and they're roosting above the pigs in some of the sheds.
That's what I was wondering, is if it had to do with a roost being right above a pig farm, you know, or.
And you know, you look back at the camel, the MERS coronavirus, and the speculation, we thought, you know, that was originally a bat virus, and it might have been from 40 or 50 or 60 years ago. It got established in camels, but we set up, you know, little nighttime camera traps or camel farms, and the bats come in and drink out of the water troughs at night. So they're flying down and drinking in the camel water troughs every night. And no one's ever, you ask the camel herders, do you have bats? And they all say, no, there's no bats here. They don't even know bats exist. They go like, we have some birds, but we don't have any bats. And we've set up cameras and you see them coming, swooping down and drinking water out of the water troughs, and the camels come out in the morning and go drink that same water. Yeah.
Scott Hingstrom asked, all other emergent infectious diseases have taken a backseat to COVID-19. What is the current status of highly pathogenic avian influenza in birds and humans?
Wow, there's an outbreak right now in Europe that no one seems to care about. You're right. I know. I don't know what to do about that. You know, the human ability to have, you know, more than one priority is very challenging for our species. I don't know what to do about that.
So it was a good question, Scott. It's happening right now. And then he followed up with, One Health has been around a while. Are wildlife managers, veterinarians, and medical doctors starting to speak the same language, in your opinion?
You know, I think it's, I've been watching it now for 15 years. It seems to be getting better. More people are using it. They, you know, they don't always mean the same thing. But I certainly have given up on trying to convince everybody to use it the same way. It's kind of like, okay, fine. You know, it's kind of, I don't want to be evangelical and they have to share all my beliefs. If they care, I'm now at the point that they care. I'm happy that they care. And, you know, maybe they have a different version of it than me. And it's like, okay, fine, I can't deal with that. But I was on a call this morning with the humanitarian aid community, and they're all responding to COVID-19, but they're more used to dealing with disasters once again. And so we're trying to get that One Health message, and they're having a hard time getting their head around it too, and going like, well, what's that got to do with humanitarian aid? And I try to make it relevant for them somehow. And I know with the Ebola outbreaks in West Africa, as soon as the UN Food and Agriculture Organization said, oh, it might be in pigs, everybody panicked because they didn't know if they could eat. They go like, oh, so what should we eat? What do you mean we can't eat? And then with avian influenza, the president of the Congo told people that you could get it from chicken bouillon. So people were freaking out. So, you know, so I use those as examples where we can kind of come together with One Health to at least for risk communication, reduce fear, you know, advance understanding. Even if it's too late to control the outbreak, there's still knowledge that could be shared across sectors. Or maybe we shouldn't kill all the bats. It's really too late to do that because COVID-19 is spread around the world. So don't kill bats, it won't help you. So I still think it's really important to bring that message in.
Excellent. The next question comes from Concerned Citizen, which I love.
Oh, nice.
How common is it around the world to have a certain percentage of the population hold to a belief that their strong faith in their God or gods will provide themselves and their community with a shield of protection against any infection and its aftermath, that outsiders and their science is to be very suspicious of?
I think it's pretty common. I don't have a percentage. And it varies though. I mean, it certainly varies from country to country. I think if you go to Finland, you'd get a very low number there. And then, oh, look, we have somebody from Finland or of Finnish descent. Yeah, they're very science oriented. They're kind of very fact-based there, has been my impression. So that's always refreshing. And then in this country, of course, it varies by state and by region and states. And I grew up in South Carolina, so even there we had a lot of variation in people's attitudes and cultures, and you have different, you know, so it really, it varies tremendously, but I kind of feel like it's challenging. I mean, we have the anti-vaxxers and measles, and I don't, you know, that's just a different version of this question. It is kind of this question. And you have to somehow find a way to meet people where they are. I just kind of stop, once again, being so evangelical about my beliefs. And I just try to work with them with their beliefs. And that's just kind of good enough. You know, I don't know. I don't have another solution. But I do think, you know, it's been interesting and very deeply religious population. I used to work in Africa a lot with the missionaries and fly around with them, missionary air pilots and stuff. And, you know, within a few weeks, you know, the prayer before takeoff was, you know, protect us, God, and all of those that are protecting your creatures too. So they kind of immediately just integrated in their thinking. It was really a wonderful thing.
That's a really good question. And it was a really good question for Billy specifically, because he has seen all of the far reaches of this earth. So it was a really good question. Frankie, is a prospective PhD student hoping to research bats in one of their disease hotspots, Southeast Asia, Africa, South America. Do you know of any leading edge topics that you think a PhD student should be focusing on to be best equipped to step into a career in this field? Another excellent question for Dr. Karesh.
Yeah, don't do it.
Stop. Can I mute him?
No, no. I think it's a wide open field, and especially right now, I think, you know, it is a great time. There's a lot of interest, and there are, you know, and it doesn't have to be coronaviruses, and there are a lot of interesting things going on with bats. And the question is, you know, is your interest more on the, you know, what angle do you want to go through? Is there, you know, there on the ecology side, that the world is your oyster. There is just not much work done. Good work on bat ecology, and the good news is there's over 1,200 species, so there's no way anyone studied all of those. When you review the literature, you know, the most studied mammal on the planet is the red fox, you know, with thousands of papers published on red fox diseases. And, you know, for many bat species, there's not one. So you have a whole wide world. And then just on the basic ecology, migration, movement, reproduction, it's just a wide open world. We don't understand bat immunology. If you're more like a lab type, there's a whole world and some great people looking at immunological, I hate to say it's suppression, but it's really about tolerance. Instead of, we are all taught about disease resistance in our SIRS models, or about susceptible resistant population. We've totally ignored this concept of tolerance, which has nothing to do with resistance, that you get this organism, you live with it happily, you shed it, it doesn't really affect you. It's really about commensalism and sympatry with viruses. that's really, no one's looking, that in bats or really other species too. If we could understand how to become infected, tolerate the infection without adverse effects, and clear that infection, we wouldn't need antimicrobials anymore. We wouldn't need antibiotics and antivirals. So there's some really interesting stuff in that physiology world. So I think there's a lot to be done. I wish I was smart enough to actually do it myself, but I would love, happy to put you in touch with people that are smarter and would love to have some grad students.
Any other questions for Billy while we have him here? Frankie says, thank you, Billy.
Oh, very welcome.
Yeah, loved your image of a logging camp in a rainforest and all involved. Is there any way we can extract, and then something popped up, I can't read it, ourselves from boom and bust phenomena?
I don't know. I don't know. And I'm not an anti-forestry person. I just think that we do funny things in funny places. So if you remember the Hotspots map in the beginning, I think what's happened is, like, in northern Canada, that map was like pretty green. It was very low risk of emerging infectious diseases from the Canadian forest. And, and they do forestry there and they do mining there, and no one seems to get really sick and nothing, they don't get Ebola. But then these companies come in and go like, well, we figured this out in Canada, let's go do it in Congo. And it's like, well, maybe it's not appropriate in that environment. You can't just like transplant your technique. They're not easily transferable. So if you're going to do logging in the Congo, you have to deal with, the environment and the ecology of Congo. It's not Canada, it's not North America. So we have really, interesting and well-developed and sophisticated agricultural practices and forestry practices and mining operations. And then somebody else tries to duplicate that on the cheap somewhere in some poor country, and they can make a bunch of money and be a little sloppy with prevention and medical care or food. And I think that's what the world has to wake up to. It's not like you can't do it, but if you're going to do it, you need to do it professionally and do it, wisely.
Jen is stunned to hear that red foxes are the most studied animal. I think someone once told me it was the white-tailed deer. That would have been my guess. Yeah. As well.
It might have been you, Shelley, that told me that.
Because I make up stuff all the time. That's not news.
Yeah.
But I
would be North America.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
But at a global scale, the foxes are.
Is that in terms of just like ecology or physiology or disease or all of it?
Yeah, I think so. I think if you do a lit search and do red fox, it'll be because of all of Europe, and that's been going on for hundreds of years before we even started doing much here in the US.
Wow. Interesting. Thank you.
Well, I think I can speak for the whole audience in saying that was fabulous, and learned so much as per normal when I listened to your talks. And thank you so much for your time and sharing your expertise with the group.